Hi, welcome to the Stories Beside channel. Enjoy watching. Hello, John with you, and a new author story from my channel. It doesn't work that way. Every time she went to work, Ashley literally told herself to be patient, not realizing how long this nightmare could go on. Until recently, she happily worked as a nurse in one of the surgical departments of the city hospital. From childhood, the girl knew what she would be when she grew up, and after graduating from medical school, she plunged headlong into her new profession. She worked day and night, agreeing to any schedule or shift. It was not so much for the money, which of course was needed, as for the pleasure of doing what she loved. Patients on the ward would try to get a shot or an IV. It was to her that they said she did procedures like a magician. That would have been all right. But Ashley, ever since the orphanage where she grew up, had not tolerated unfair lies. The fact was that the head of the department where she worked regularly deceived patients. He made unsubstantiated conclusions and appointments. His goal was to squeeze as much money out of the patients as possible. Ashley, being herself from a poor, remote village, saw that many of them could barely scrape together enough money to show up at the local luminary. And after hearing one day, as Vincent was the name of the manager, draws not a rosy prospect for the fragile girl who came with her elderly mother, she decided to restore justice by earning a red diploma upon graduation. She had a good outlook and knew that much more affordable treatment could be prescribed in this situation. And the disease itself wasn't as dangerous as it was advertised to be. She heard the girl, barely able to hold back her tears, reassuring her mother, "Everything will be all right, Mommy. We will definitely find the money, and you will be healthy." In the corridor, the patient's daughter made long telephone calls, and most likely the calls did not bring the desired result. The girl sat down on a bench in the corridor and cried. This was the last straw in her patience, the nurse. Ashley put herself in that poor girl's shoes at that moment. Ashley waited for the doctor to come out after rounds and approached in a quiet but determined voice to begin. "Vincent, you do realize that this family obviously doesn't have the money for the treatment that you prescribed, right?" "Yeah, they don't need it." For a moment, he was taken aback by this insolence, but then he literally hissed back at Ashley. "What do you think you're doing? Who do you think you are? Well, go back to your place and do your duties." From that day on, all hell broke loose at the hospital for Ashley. She was dreading going to work and didn't know what she was going to get picked on again. Vincent, he, not embarrassed by the staff or the patients. Now he told the girl off on every little thing if he couldn't find it, if he couldn't find anything to complain about. In his work, he was sure to go over her appearance. The fact was that Ashley was young and beautiful, tall, overweight, but very charming. She never gave much thought to her appearance. The girl was larger than her peers from birth and already accustomed to taunts and sneers in her address. But that all remained in childhood. So it seemed to her before. Now it became the cause of ridicule, peers, which turned out to be much more offensive. One morning, as Ashley was getting ready to take her shift, Vincent walked in. He was in a great mood, said hello to the nurses, defiantly turning his back on Ashley. Then, as if remembering, he turned to her. "Ashley, I thought you might want to lose some weight, and you don't know enough to be a nurse in this department. That's why I've decided to do some work. A nurse would be good for you and very suitable for such a simple country girl." On the way to the door, he turned and threw Ashley angrily toward the door. "I hope the floors and windows are shiny and the vessels are taken out regularly. Now you'll be busy all day with physical labor and thinking about nonsense or minding your own business. You won't have time." Smiling and winking at the local Jessica beauty, he headed for the exit. At that moment, Ashley wanted to run, hide, or just burst into tears. But she knew there was no one to pity or comfort her. And to show weakness in front of this despot she was not going to. The whole staff from the first minutes of the conflict of the village simpleton and the famous surgeon in the city, of course, sided with him. Over Ashley only joked and laughed. They said, "Found someone to compete with." It was necessary to do their business quietly and stay out of the way. Such a simpleton was taken to one of the best hospitals in the city. But no, he decided to fight for the truth, whispering behind his back. Would you be glad that with your looks and orphanage background they had taken you to a well-known hospital in the city? Jessica reprimanded her, and it was easy for her to reason. The girl herself was not from a rich family, but her mother and grandmother worked 3 jobs so that Jessica did not need anything. But the pretty girl was not interested in that at all. After all, she blew her salary in restaurants and at discos, not thinking about what she would live on. Jessica was always surrounded by crowds of admirers, and every other patient gave her flowers and candy. Her superiors, too, were very lenient with her. Others would have been fired for the violations Jessica committed, but she could only smile and say, "Jessica, how could that be? You better pull yourself together and try not to do anything else." She responded, lowered her eyes, and shyly smiling. She could say herself, "I do not know how it happened. I swear, never again." How could you, a spoiled beauty, understand Ashley, who had no one to take care of her for a long time? The girl had counted on herself for years. So now she decided to be patient, no matter what. You have to live on something. Now, when Ashley cleaned the wards or scrubbed the floors in the hospital corridor, she often thought back to the past, not understanding why life was giving her such an ordeal. Ashley had never seen her parents, or rather, her mother's picture was always hanging by her bedside at Carol's grandmother's house. And she also managed to keep one very small card, and she always carried it with her. But that was all that was left of her mother as a child. When asked about her mother, Grandma Carol wailed that the doctors were lame and had ruined her daughter. If she were in town, they would have helped her. The village ignoramuses have ruined the young girl who has not lived and walks on the ground. Sometimes, she went on, I told her I'm sorry, God, she didn't need a child. But your mother was stubborn. If she did, she wouldn't change her mind. From such lamentations, Ashley had only one conclusion to draw from such lamentations. She was certainly not a wanted child. Her mother had died within the first 24 hours of giving birth. But again, that was according to her grandmother. They lived in the middle of nowhere, where the only paramedic was rarely sober. Grandma Carol grumbled angrily. Your mother is Sarah, decided to be a city girl, ran off to make a life for herself in the district center. And when she got a bellyful, she went back to her mother's place. On those rare occasions, Grandma would cry softly, wiping away a tear with the corner of her handkerchief. But if Ashley tried to ask anything about her father, Grandma would close the subject at once. The wind in the field. Your father is a hurricane in the sky you can't find, you can't catch. Go and do not ask again. The girl knew right away that the subject was closed, and not a word more could be gotten out of Granny. On such days, Grandma would walk around frowning, muttering something under her nose, apparently scolding the unknown father. Grandma Carol was strict, but fair. Ashley knew that she loved and pitied her very much, but tried not to show it. They lived poorly, but the girl always had everything she needed. Her pension was small, and her grandmother worked almost to her last day as a part-time maid at the local village store and post office. Neighbors who could help gave things from their children. Grandma, not wanting to offend, took everything. Then in the evening, she would close on the veranda and carefully look through, selecting only the good stuff, washed and ironed. And in the morning, Ashley had beautiful, almost like new outfits. What are you doing? Did you fall asleep? Ashley from the past, screaming for the head nurse. Look, Vincent's going to see you sleeping on the move. He'll definitely lose his bonus, she added, and walked off down the corridor. Ashley sighed and thought she could forget about the bonus altogether. Evil Vincent, she nicknamed the surgeon. Surely he would do his best to make sure she didn't get it. The girl sighed, and after changing the water in the bucket, went to finish cleaning the hallway. Ashley scrubbed the floors, and mentally she was far away again from this day in the past filled with sad memories of change and betrayal. She often remembered one of the worst days of her life, the day her grandmother died. She came home from school and immediately sensed something was wrong. There was no smell of food in the house. Her grandmother didn't make any noise with the dishes. She always had dinner ready for her granddaughter when she came home. And here Ashley saw her lying on the floor by the door with her eyes open, as if she were staring at the ceiling. Anya first tried to call out quietly, "Granny, what are you?" Laid down. But even at her incomplete 12, she realized that the irreparable happened. Breaking head, she ran to the neighbors, sobbing. On the move, it was either tears or rain, or more likely, both veiled her eyes, and the girl nearly fell several times, but tried to run as fast as possible. She was scared in her heart. It seemed that the faster she reached, the faster her grandmother and help. After crossing the neighbor's threshold, Anya began waving toward her house and whispering to her grandmother. Their granny exhausted, she sat down right on the floor at the entrance. And then everything was like a dream. The neighbors all came running in, crying, stroking her head, and wailing. "Orphan girl, how are you now? Who needs you now?" That night they put her to bed with her neighbors, and they whispered and talked about something. The women were crying. Every now and then the men went out into the yard to smoke. Immediately after her grandmother's funeral, Ashley was placed in an orphanage, which was located in the nearest neighborhood center. Ashley was not very sociable as it was, and there she shut herself off and didn't talk to anyone. More often than not, she could be seen sitting on the sidelines with books or at the door of a medical office. Ashley could spend hours studying posters and pamphlets on medical topics. A young doctor who worked at the orphanage took notice of the plump, quiet girl. One day, she quietly approached the girl, who was studying the medical poster once again, and asked, "Are you curious? Do you want to see what's in the study?" Ashley didn't hesitate and started nodding her head quickly, as if afraid that Elizabeth would change her mind. Holding her breath, the girl stared at the medical instruments, and from that day on, she was a frequent visitor to the Temple of Medicine. It seemed to her then that the lives of all the residents of the orphanage depended on Elizabeth. She even thought that if this woman had been there for her grandmother and mother, they would surely be alive. After all, whoever came into that office with what pain always came out with a smile on their face. Pain was sure to stay behind that door. It was probably one of those moments when she decided to train to be a medical professional and help people. She wanted to become the same kind of fairy wizard, able to cure any disease. Ashley diligently prepared for admission, and when the time came without problems, she became a medical student. Elizabeth was always there to help and support her in everything. By that time, Ashley was unrecognizable from a little girl. She grew into a stately beauty with a long plait. She was very different from her classmates, talking only about guys and diets. Ashley wasn't interested in that at all. Therefore, orphanage beauties were surprised when the fat girl, as they used to call her since childhood, began to wait at the gate of boarding school town Handsome. It became clear why the girl's eyes recently emitted a kind of unprecedented brilliance. She looked prettier, and even at her weight, she became something airy and floating. It turned out that the girl fell in love, and the feelings were mutual. They met by chance. Ashley liked to wander in the park by the nearby lake, which was very close to the orphanage. In good weather, she could sit on the shore, forgetting about the time with bad weather, just wandering the alleys, dreaming about the future or reminiscing about the past. On one such day, a guy on a bicycle almost ran over her. Either she was clumsy or he didn't manage a turn. They both apologized awkwardly at first. Then they laughed, and the young man suggested, "I, as a gentleman, am obliged to apologize. So I suggest that in this dank weather you have a cup of coffee and try a very tasty pie. The local coffee house makes them very well." The girl, of course, agreed. They drank what she thought was delicious coffee and discussed books, which, as it turned out, were read by the same people. Then they wandered around for a long time and talked about everything. There was absolutely no desire to part that evening, and the young people agreed to meet there the next day. Then every day Michael, as the young man's name was called, stood at the entrance of the boarding school, waiting for his bell. The roommates whispered in bewilderment, what could this handsome city man find in the village commoner? But every time they met, it was as if the couple did not notice anything or anyone around them. They were happy for every day, every moment spent together. After high school, Ashley easily got into medical school. The first and perhaps the only one who congratulated her on this joyful event was Michael. He greeted her with a huge bouquet, kissed her, and said, "You are so smart. I had no doubt that you will get in." He supported Ashley almost always and in everything, and became the closest person to the girl during this time. Everything about the relationship. The couple was so easy and joyful that Ashley never even wondered why Michael was in no hurry to introduce her beloved to her parents. The lovers were already dreaming of how, after serving in the army, Michael would return and they would play a wedding. Seeing her beloved off to his duty station, Ashley cried and said, "Nothing, it's only temporary, and the separation will only make our love stronger. Yes, my love." Michael, wiping tears from his cheeks, whispered in his ear with a smile, "Of course, dear. Before you know it, I'll be here." The young man was drafted into the army thousands of kilometers away, and the only salvation for the girl were the letters, which she waited impatiently for. At first, they were frequent, with many tender words. But with each month, the letters began to come less and less frequently, and became something cold, friendly. The closer her beloved's return came, the fewer letters there were. Ashley didn't think about it. She was counting the days until his return, but it didn't happen the way she expected it to. One day, as she was returning from the college to the dormitory, where she had lived all her years of study, she was called over by the janitor. "That soldier came to see you." He didn't wait, gave her the message. The girl immediately recognized the handwriting of her beloved. She kept all his letters in a box with white shoes, bought for the occasion. She had already imagined how it would be at their wedding with Michael. She looked again at the envelope. There was not a single postmark on it. The letter had obviously been brought to the dormitory, not mailed. The girl smiled happily, for it meant that her Michael had arrived. In those moments, she had only one thought, that her beloved was in a hurry and decided to surprise her. She was sure that the envelope indicated the place and time of their long-awaited meeting. Ashley ran into the room, forgetting to thank the janitor for the letter, and without undressing, plunged into a chair to open the envelope. The first lines seemed to her alien and cold. "Hello, Ashley. Forgive me, but it is easier to write than to say it to my face. I turned out to be such a coward." The girl reread the first lines over and over again, and could not believe that her beloved Michael had written it. There wasn't one familiar, gentle word. Something inside stretched tight as a string, and Ashley became afraid that it would burst, and she would die. She pulled herself together and decided to finish, but she read Michael's confession like a dream, like the worst dream of her life. Michael wrote that his parents wouldn't let them be together anyway. Next, that they had made up their minds long ago, and he would marry a former classmate. The girl's father is a partner in his father's business, and Michael's mother is supposedly very ill, and her heart couldn't take it if he went against their will. "It's better for both of us. I'm sorry, you're bound to be happy." These were the last words of her beloved. After reading the letter to the end, Ashley sat for a long time, hands down, staring into the darkness at the window behind the glass. It was pouring rain, as if mourning her love. If one were to look at the girl at that moment from a distance, one might take her for a stone statue. In the darkness of the room, she seemed to be a gray, lifeless creature. That evening, it was as if the girl's life was divided into before and after. She had had similar feelings the day of her grandmother's funeral, only then it was death that was to blame. And it was hard to blame anyone. Now, in her adult life, the betrayal of a loved one was such a boundary between the past and the future. For a while, Ashley lived without remembering, without understanding what was happening. Rather out of habit, she went to school. She came back, went to bed, got up again, and went to school. It was still good that those were my last days in the school. There were still some organizational issues to deal with. To get an honestly earned red diploma, to turn in the textbooks to the library, and to prepare for the release of the dormitory room. When all this was done, Ashley clearly decided to flee from the past, erase everything from her memory, and start her life with a clean slate. As an excellent student, she was offered a job at the district hospital, but she decided to go as far away as possible to a huge city and lose herself forever. Years later, Ashley often remembered how she tore the letters from the army so dear to her heart into tiny shreds, and the tears did not stop flowing down her cheeks. The girl well remembered how, leaving the dormitory, she put the hard-won white shoes for the wedding on the table, putting beside a note to the new student for good luck. It seemed to her that way she got rid of everything that bound her to the past, and off she went to meet the yet unknown future. Sitting on the train, Ashley looked at the scenery that flashed outside the window and was sure she could never love and be loved again. Finding herself at the large and beautiful train station of a huge metropolis, Ashley was instantly confused for the first time. After all, it was a completely different world. The city reminded her of an anthill. Everyone was in a hurry. No one said hello to anyone. People didn't look like the people of her village, who knew each other by name. In the city, everyone was occupied with his own thoughts, living his own life. Ashley, finding herself in this new colored world, realized now she needed to settle down and start living again. Much to learn. A lot to learn. The girl could not find a place to live for a long time. While still in the district center, she earned extra money as a nurse in the evenings during her studies, so she diligently saved penny to penny for her future wedding. After all that, Ashley decided to use the money she had raised for new purposes and a new life. Leaving for the city, Anya thought this stash would last her a long time. But it turned out that even renting a decent place to live was impossible with that money. When she had already completely lost hope in her eyes, a small piece of paper on a pole near the train station hit her. The price the landlady had quoted on the phone suited Ashley. True, it was almost all her money, but there was no choice. On a pre-purchased map of the city, she found the address. It was very far from the train station, almost on the very outskirts. A small room in an old two-bedroom on the first floor. All the furniture consisted of a nightstand, a bed, and a small hand-wrought table. The room didn't even have a closet. There was nowhere to put it. There were a few coat hooks behind the door, though. It was very poor, but clean. There was a beautiful geranium on the little windowsill, and hanging old ones, but the curtains were whitewashed. The landlady was a skinny old lady with kind eyes. Ellen immediately, as if apologizing, said, "I'm sorry, honey." The room of the deceased's son. He drank heavily and drank away all the furniture. It turned out that her son died 3 years ago, and she didn't want to rent it out. But life forced her to. It wasn't easy to live on one pension. At one moment, Ashley did not have time to turn around, and Ellen had already returned from her room, solemnly carrying in her hands an old mirror on a glued leg. "How can you be so beautiful without a mirror?" "I have no reason to." "Why look in it?" On her old age, sadly, she added. That same evening, Ellen took Ashley into the kitchen, almost ordering her to unashamedly use everything she saw. On the first day, the girl went in search of a job. A graduate of medical school with honors was immediately admitted to one of the city hospitals. Work in surgery was not easy, and to get there was almost an hour one way. But Ashley was fine with it. Ashley accepted all of her shifts and substitutes for others. The hard work and the drive to get there. And also and back took a lot of energy and time, leaving no room for thoughts of the past. Despite her rigorous schedule, Ashley sometimes liked to walk a couple of stops on foot. One day in the street darkness, she heard a soft cry or squeak. Turning in the direction from which the pitiful sounds came, Ashley saw a small shaggy lump with shiny button eyes. It turned out to be a very immature puppy. The puppy looked very unhappy. Ashley picked it up in her arms, not afraid to get it dirty, and cradled it and spoke poorly. "Where did you come from? That's it, don't flinch. Now let's go wash and feed and get acquainted." When Ashley came in with the new tenant, the landlady was only happy that I would have more fun while Ashley was away at work, Ellen said, taking the baby in her arms. Again, the man in the house cheerfully added the hostess. When they had washed the foundling, he turned out to be a real miracle. All black, only one ear and hind legs were white. So they nicknamed him Balak, from white black, and Bell for short. Anya now happily hurried home, where her faithful friend greeted her wagging her tail, and she happily talked about his oddities of the day. It would be all right. Ashley had already begun to remember the past less frequently and to get used to the present, and if it were not for the unfortunate conflict with the surgeon, she was hurt to tears. Trained on excellent washing floors in the hospital and listening to the reproaches of this autocrat. But there was nothing to do. She had to live on something. So Ashley continued to come to work without much desire and with fear of every day. Despite this, she tried to perform her duties impeccably. She cleaned and scrubbed. The patients loved her very much. Only now, they pitied and harangued her. How Ashley missed her golden hands. To give an injection or take a stitch. No one does it better than you. But the girl only responds. She answered, smiling sadly that it might all work out. "I'll give you some injections." She really hoped that the unfortunate Vincent would someday change his anger for mercy and return her to her previous duties. But all remained unchanged, and Ashley continued to clean the ward every morning. The day began with Vincent demanding that the pay ward be scrubbed to a shine. There were several rooms at the end of the corridor, separated from the rest by an archway of living plants. Each of the rooms had a small refrigerator and a TV. In summer, the air conditioner worked. In winter, there was additional heating for the rooms, their own humidifier and quartz. Even the menu was special, albeit dietary, but exquisite and served directly to the ward. The attending physician of the patients on these wards was, of course, Vincent himself. He spent most of his time here fawning over each patient. Of course, a day's stay in that room cost almost as much as Ashley's monthly salary. On top of that, every time the relatives solemnly handed the chief physician weighty bags of gifts, Ashley seemed to expect it every time. Sometimes, when he received a bag of gifts and took a sneaky peek, he was obviously disappointed, and his attitude immediately changed. He would say goodbye to his patients coldly and immediately leave, referring to his work. Once she herself saw him discharged after an operation for removal of appendicitis. The patient dropped money into the surgeon's pocket. Ashley looked away quickly at that moment and waited for them to say goodbye before she went to prepare the room for the new patient. Immersed in her own thoughts, Ashley then changed the bedding, dusted the furniture and windowsill for a clean one. When her turn came to the little white nightstand, on one of the shelves she saw a phone. It was very beautiful and obviously expensive. The girl had only seen these before on billboards or on the pages of magazines. Her small button phone looked like a toy from the past century. The phone she found had no buttons and a screen that she could look into like a mirror. Ashley, in her 20s, was holding such an expensive device for the first time. She stared at the wonder of technology for a while, then gently touched the screen with her finger. The phone was not locked, and immediately appeared a beautiful screensaver. Ashley even flinched. She didn't think it was possible to turn on modern technology so easily. She was confused. She didn't know what to do next. Her first thought was to take it to the head doctor, but that idea she immediately crossed out. Seeing him again was beyond her strength. Every meeting with that despot lately ended with a scandal and unfounded recriminations against her. The girl decided not to bring his thunder and lightning down on herself, but to wait a little longer. And then the owner will come back for the lost thing. Ashley thought and put the phone in her robe pocket. The girl hoped all day long that someone would come for the phone, but the owner never showed up. In the evening, Locked in the room where all her equipment was, Ashley began to study the newfangled technology. She decided to find contacts of relatives, mom, dad, or anyone else close to her. Ashley didn't yet know which one of them a former patient had, but she wanted to find a number and report that she was missing. The girl pressed the wrong screen for a long time, then went out, and then came back on. Suddenly, old pictures began to pop up, but very well processed. Ashley was not going to pry into someone else's life and already wanted to turn off the phone. But on the screen was her mother. She was smiling the same way she was in the picture at her grandmother's house above her bed. Ashley only her mother. She looked happy in the picture on the phone. She had some guy hugging her, and they were definitely in love. She couldn't figure out how an old photo of her mom ended up with a patient from the VIP room, and what they could possibly have in common. After what had happened, she tried even harder to find her relatives' contacts. When she saw her father's entry in the phone book, she immediately dialed the number. How could she do that? She didn't know the expensive machine, so she decided to call from her own. A low, velvet voice answered on the other end. Ashley timidly began. "Excuse me, this is the nurse," she corrected herself, "an orderly from the hospital. We have a patient who forgot his phone. Your number is listed as the father. I'm sorry, so I decided to call you." The man listened, thanked, and said he would try to come over as soon as possible. About a half hour later, a tall, gray-haired man found Ashley in the ward with the same patient who had forgotten his phone. The men vied to thank the girl and offer her money, which she flatly refused. When the guy tried to put bills in the pocket of her robe, as when discharging a surgeon, Ashley quietly, but rather sharply replied, "I will not take the money." After a little silence, she added, "But I'd appreciate it if you tell me how you got the picture of my mother in your phone." Seeing the surprise on the men's faces, Ashley blushed heavily and realized that she had given herself away. Ashley confessed that she went into the phone, and as if in justification added, "I had to find at least someone's phone number of relatives to give this expensive toy." The young man's father was the first one to start the conversation. His name, as it turned out, was Norman, and his son's name was Louis. The man, smiling, said to Ashley, "Sweet young lady, take a closer look. I certainly have changed, but you can still recognize me in the photo." He held out his son's phone. And Ashley, however, realized that it was him in the photo, only very young, with no gray hair on his temples. Yeah, I'd been slimmer and had thicker hair back then. The years do not paint anyone. And next to me in the picture is my beloved wife, Mary. We lived happily together for a long time, and we continue to live happily ever after, waiting for grandchildren from this Otloman. He jokingly rubbed the young man and added, "In front of you, the result of our love, the only restless son, Louis." With a smile, he nodded toward Ashley, who understood nothing. It seemed to her to be some kind of dream. She couldn't be mistaken. It was definitely her mother in the photo. "That's my mother," the girl said timidly. "Only she's long dead. I'm sure of it. I never saw her in person. She died as soon as I was born. I only know her from her picture. Yes, I'll prove it to you." The girl ran away and returned a few minutes later with a small faded one. She handed the picture to the man. "Look, this is my mother, Sarah. She passed away. I would only be glad if she were alive." Norman gently took the picture from her hands and looked at it silently for a while. "Let me refute the assertion that the beauty in the picture is alive and unharmed. What can you be sure of, too?" He offered to go with them and see the girl with the photo in person, so to speak. They agreed that the very next day he would pick up the nurse after work, and she, having visited them, would meet the heroine of the photograph in person. She was very afraid, not understanding why, but she could not refuse the meeting. She knew she would never get her mother back. By meeting her copy, she hoped to find the close relatives she had missed all these years. She prepared for this trip very carefully. Her hostess, upon learning of the event, meticulously helped her in choosing an outfit, And even in the end, she solemnly gave me a small brooch in the shape of a butterfly. My beloved husband gave it to me, and it has always brought me good luck. Good luck, little girl, Ellen said, and furtively wiped away a tear, crossed herself, and went to her room. The blouse and skirt. Ashley had chosen one very similar to the one her mother wore in the picture. She had always wanted very much to look like her. And looking at herself in the mirror that evening, Ashley seemed that she was a reflection of her mother's photo. The girl really did look a lot like her mother. The whole day she worked, thinking only about the forthcoming meeting, and waited impatiently for the evening. At the appointed time, Norman was already waiting for her at the hospital door. "Good evening, Ashley," he began. Seeing her timidity, he smiled and continued, "Why are you so confused? Everything is all right. And maybe we will uncover some secrets soon." Ashley noticed that his voice trembled a little. It was obvious that Norman himself was worried, but he tried not to show it. They barely spoke on the road. They were both deep in thought. The house they drove up to surprised Ashley with its size. The 3-story cottage with huge windows on the first floor could hold a huge number of people. Ashley could not even imagine that only 3 people could live in such a mansion. At first glance, it seemed to her that this house could accommodate 4 or even 5 of Grandma Carol's houses. There was a beautifully manicured lawn in front of the building. There were plenty of flower beds around the perimeter, and the owners were very fond of flowers. At this moment, Ashley even felt sorry that it was not the season, and there would be no opportunity to admire the blossoms and inhale the fragrance of this beauty. The girl timidly got out of the car and was afraid to take a step along the neatly paved paths. She tried to see everything as best she could, but she was shy. But she noticed at once that she could feel the master's hand in everything. Everything was in its place and blended in well with the general view. "Why are you so bewildered? Don't be afraid. Nobody bites here," said Norman. He took Ashley by the arm and led her toward the house. As soon as they crossed the threshold, a woman came into the hall like 2 peas in a pod, who resembled Ashley's mother, only slightly older, holding out her hand to the bewildered girl. She introduced herself. "Good afternoon. I'm Mary. And you, Ashley? My husband told me yesterday. Come in, don't be shy." All the furnishings in the house were very beautiful and expensive, and as well as on the property, perfectly thought out. That said, Ashley noticed that everything was somehow especially cozy. The beautiful oak furniture in the living room matched perfectly with the antique, perfectly restored sideboard. On the wall above the couch was a gallery of portraits of very different times, and in the kitchen there were beautiful landscapes. Noticing the girl's interest in the canvases, Norman, hugging his wife, said, "These are all my Mary's works. For some time now she has found joy in it and gives it to us." As they sat around the table looking at the family photo album, Ashley couldn't understand how Magyum could have known about her sister. As they later drank tea in the kitchen, the hostess, holding a photo of Ashley's mother, lamented for a long time, "I don't understand how this can be. For as long as I can remember, I always lived with my parents. I was my only and very favorite daughter. They did everything so that I did not need anything. Yeah, I'm gonna show you a picture from our Norman wedding. They're so happy there." Saying this with a kind of sadness, she quickly returned with a wedding photo of an elderly man and woman standing next to them, holding hands and smiling happily. Mary said quietly, "A year later, Mommy was gone, and 2 more years later, Daddy's heart stopped." That evening, Mary and Norman asked a lot about Ashley and her mother's life. But what could she tell if she had never seen her? Only how she missed her mother's caress and care, how she wanted, being older, to cuddle up and tell about all her troubles. They parted that evening as old and very good friends. The hosts asked them not to disappear and to be sure to come and visit. Norman had already decided at this point that he had to get to the bottom of what had happened. The next morning he arrived at the office. He was the owner of a large construction company and gave the security chief the task of finding out all the details of the twins' birth. A couple of days later, everything became known. Years ago, the girls had been abandoned right in their parents' home. Immediately after the birth, their mother, having written a renunciation, disappeared, and no one ever saw her again. The girls were transferred to the baby house, and soon the pretty, perfectly healthy babies were taken to more than one family. As it turned out, they were taken to different families. Mama Ashley was taken first. The one who was taken was Carol's grandmother. She was still a young, vibrant woman then, but very lonely. She had lost her husband a few years before, burned like a candle in a week. There was once a son, but he had been killed in a car accident. So she was left alone. Her neighbor advised her to go to the next district. There was a baby house. Take a daughter or a son for yourself without taking care. She planned for a long time, postponed the trip several times, but made up her mind, and upon her arrival, immediately fell in love with the baby with brown eyes. She already knew for sure that she was going to take the little girl, only when it turned out that she had a sister, difficulties arose. The director of the orphanage persuaded her to take both. She explained that she couldn't. Otherwise, we couldn't separate the two little girls. How could they be separated? Everyone insisted, even the nannies. The woman understood that in her backwoods she would not be able to raise two children. But luckily for her, it turned out that the second baby was already being taken by a young couple from out of town. That's how it turned out that Sarah was the name of Ashley's mother. Since then, she grew up in a small and semi-abandoned village with Carol, and the second of the sisters, Mary, in a town thousands of miles away in a well-to-do family. Sarah had all her outfits, for the most part, obtained from the neighbors, and Mary's father brought from abroad, where he was often on business trips. But neither of the sisters even suspected that there was a bloodline somewhere, exactly like her sister, just like a carbon copy. As soon as Mary learned all the details about her sister, she asked Ashley to go with her to her grave. On the next free day, Norman took them to the cemetery in the village where Ashley was born and lived for some time. They did not immediately find a wooden cross with a plaque and a faded photo. They sat there for a long time, crying silently. Then Mary said quietly, "I'm sorry, sister, that I didn't find it. I didn't know." Already turning to her husband, added Norman, "We should put a monument, and I will plant beautiful flowers." In time, indeed, from afar, one could see the modest but well-groomed grave, which always had plenty of fresh flowers in season. From the day everyone knew the secret of the sisters, Ashley began to be treated in this family as a close relative. They tried in every possible way to help support. They insisted that she not return to the wilderness, but stay in town. Her auntie, now she was the girl's real family. She took care of her in every way. Through her acquaintances, she helped her find an affordable, separate, albeit small, apartment. The price was symbolic. The owner was a friend of Ellen's. After leaving for a year on contract in another region, she gladly let the girl work. Had to pay the utilities and take care of houseplants. Everything was working out just fine. One sad, unresolved issue remained. Ashley kept mopping floors instead of doing what she loved, helping people. When Norman found out that Ashley had a red diploma in medical school, he wondered if the only thing they teach there is to carry ducks and scrub floors to a shine. Ashley couldn't stand it and told him everything. Norman, learning of the conflict with the superintendent's brag-taker, quickly resolved the matter. It turned out that a longtime friend of his worked at the Ministry of Health, and after learning about what was happening in the surgical department of the city hospital, initiated an inspection. It was quickly and efficiently. The chief physician was removed from his position, and he was not the only one. It turned out that a couple of other doctors and a senior nurse of the department were involved. The road to medicine was closed to them forever. The newly arrived supervisor scrutinized the personnel files and was very surprised that such a competent graduate was cleaning windows and floors. He immediately appointed Ashley to the position of head nurse. When he announced this, he gathered the entire ward staff. There was a pause for a moment. Jessica glanced angrily at Ashley. She herself didn't mind being in that position. Status and good pay had always appealed to the girl. Only the knowledge and experience, of course, was lacking. After a minute or two, there was timid applause. Since that day, the attitude toward Ashley in the department had changed greatly, as well as her mood. Now she was happily rushing to work in the morning, and even the guard at the entrance resigned himself to the fact that she came before everyone else and was the last to leave. She was willing to spend all day and night on the ward for the work she loved. Patients called her Ashley. The only thing they regretted very much was that now she rarely gave injections and IVs herself. All the patients said that she was the only one with a light hand, and if someone was going to have an operation, they would just tearfully beg her to be the one to scrub in. This often happened as the new chief physician prophesied a great future for the girl and insisted on further training. She herself understood this, and she was already diligently preparing for college. She would take on everything in the hospital during the day and spend her nights reading her books. She really became irreplaceable in the department. She managed to perform the duties of a head nurse and to replace the ordinary medical personnel. One day, the nurse on duty was late in the morning with advance warning, and Ashley herself went to make an appointment. There was a newcomer lying in the post-op room. During the night, an emergency surgery was performed on a man in his 50s. A test had to be taken, and Ashley did everything, as always, flawlessly. It turned out that the patient needed donor blood, and it was needed urgently. The blood type was very rare, and it was negative. The department was out of the necessary material. Ashley, having carefully studied the patient's chart, was surprised, but she had exactly the same blood type with the same RA factor. Ashley was well aware that such coincidences are rare and clearly indicate kinship, but the girl was thinking first of all about the patient's life. Ashley immediately went to the head doctor. "Eric, Gerald needs blood. The transfusion station won't bring it back until this afternoon. I have exactly the same I'm ready to give." The chief doctor looked at the girl over his glasses in surprise, but he could not trust her. The young nurse always made the right decisions. Accordingly, with a nod in response, he again plunged into the study of medical history. The transfusion didn't come easily. Perhaps excitement and anxiety took its toll. The girl almost fainted, and her colleagues could hardly bring her back to her senses. All in all, everything went well, and after a few days, the patient felt much better. At one of Eric's rounds, standing at the bedside of this patient, he said everything went very well. "You have our Ashley to thank. I suggest you think about it, though. This rare group match usually indicates related genes. I suggest a DNA test." The chief physician winked at the patient and walked out of the room, leaving him pensive. Gerald, operated on, was very thoughtful for a few days, but without waiting to be discharged, he made up his mind. Since the morning, he had rehearsed the conversation with his rescuer several times and did not know how best to begin it, but finally he made up his mind. As soon as the girl appeared in the room, she heard the voice of the patient who had been silent for so long. She herself was already thinking of talking to him, but the man beat her to it. "Thank you very much," started timidly patient. "If it were not for you, I do not know if I would be alive." The doctor said that a blood match indicates the possibility of kinship. "Where are you from? Who are your parents?" At that moment, Ashley felt something tighten in her soul. She even hoped, feared, that it was her father, but secretly at heart she believed in a miracle. When she began to tell him where and with whom she lived about her mother, all that she knew from the stories Carol, then in the eyes of Gerald was the patient's name, she realized the miracle. Perhaps she had already realized in those moments that she had finally found her father, but they decided to document it. Having taken a DNA test, they waited impatiently for the result, and upon receiving it, embraced, sat in silence, and cried for a long time. My father talked about how he and Sarah had met, how they had loved each other, and how they were getting ready to marry. But then she and my mother, when they were young and foolish, had broken up because of some nonsense. They said a lot of stupid things to each other. He didn't even suspect that she was pregnant, went straight into the army, and after that he stayed in town. A couple of times he tried to look for her. Sarah carefully concealed that she was from the outback, pretending to be from the city, and he sincerely believed that she came from the same town. He looked for her in the neighborhood where they lived, but no one knew where the girl had disappeared to. For hours on end, the two sat in silence in the room, holding hands, unable to believe what had happened. Father cried, stroked Ashley's hair, and implored me to be sorry, daughter. For God's sake, I'm sorry. I had no family, no children. Thought I'd never have one. I lived with my wife for 20 years. God never gave me any children. Took my wife away too. She died 2 years ago. Now I'm so happy. I have a little girl. It was as if he couldn't believe what had happened. That night they sat hand in hand for a long time and talked about their lives. Ashley, at last, was able, as in childhood dreams, to lie down on her father's chest and talk about all the troubles and joys. The daughters found out about their happy meeting in the local paper, and in a couple of days, they were front-page heroes. Right on the front page of the Daily was a photo with a smiling Ashley, clutching tightly to her father. After being discharged from the hospital, Gerald insisted that his daughter move in with him, that you be the one wandering around in corners, paying money. I'm the one in the mansion, he told Ashley when we met. Come and live with me. We'll have more fun together. I'm at work all day, and you're not sitting at home either. We can have tea in the evenings. Ashley was embarrassed, but her father insisted, and she and Belloc moved into her father's apartment. And she was happy every night to learn new things from his life and to tell him about herself. Her father did live in a huge apartment almost in the center of the city grand hall. A kitchen, a dining room with a huge round table, and 3 whole rooms. When they first arrived, while Ashley was looking around, her father said sadly, "The apartment came from my grandmother. My wife could have sold it and bought something smaller. But my spouse and I hope to have a big family, no less than 5 children and many grandchildren. We even kept the dining room table, a big one." He stopped talking abruptly and never came back to it. Anya understood it for him as an open wound. The girl settled into one of the rooms. The room wasn't very big, but it was thoughtful and very bright. A large window faced the sunny side and the park, which made the room seem never cloudy. All the furniture was chosen in the same light tone. From this, making the room even sunnier, a beautiful carved bed, a nightstand, a neat table with a mirror and a pouf, and a closet with a fine line of gilding. Everything was somehow light and airy. It was as if this room had been knowingly prepared for a girl's daughter. Ashley was too shy to ask her father who it was for, but the aura in the room was very good, and Ashley liked the place immediately. After moving in, her father offered to invite her aunt and her family to visit. To get acquainted, he already knew the relatives from his daughter's stories and was in a hurry to meet them. After all, they turned out to be completely lonely people who had miraculously found each other, and they were excited to meet their new relatives. On their first day off, they laid the table together, and very family-like and warmly they sat with those who arrived with a big cake. Mary and Norman. Louis stopped by for a few minutes. He met Ashley's father and ran off apologetically, whispering one last word to his sister. "I'll be sure to introduce you to her. In the meantime, I'm sorry." Ashley felt that now she was the happiest person in the world. She was not alone. There was an aunt, a brother, albeit a cousin, ahead of her cherished goal, medical school, and every day waits her favorite job. They often talked to their relatives now. And with her brother, they became such good friends that they saw each other almost every day. She worked near his office, and he could even show up at lunchtime, or after work, to invite her to a nearby pastry shop for coffee and a favorite cake. Ashley wasn't even surprised by another such proposal and promised to be free in half an hour. She tried to finish everything quickly, and when she walked into the bakery, She was surprised. Her brother was not at a table alone. Next to him sat a spectacular, long-haired blonde and a young man, the sight of which gave Ashley goosebumps. A brother stood up to meet me. Meet my found by chance sister Ashley, but now my one and only favorite. Taking Ashley under his arm, he walked over to the girl at the table and continued in the same tone. And this is my favorite. I hope to become my wife, Rosa. He winked and nodded toward the handsome man at the table and said, this is also my faithful and loyal friend Winston. Unmarried, no children. Please note. Ashley went at once crimson. Could not get used to her brother's jokes. Afraid to raise her eyes to Winston, and just silently held out her hand. The black eyes under a fan of long lashes were as if drawn by a good artist. The short-cut hair lent even more charm. When Winston smiled, saying he was very pleased to meet her, Ashley realized she was lost. She was uncomfortable in this company at first. It was obvious that they had known each other for a long time. They had a lot in common and had a lot to remember. But after half an hour, she had completely forgotten that she hardly knew the guys. Communication was easy and straightforward. The guys joked and told jokes all the time, and she and Rosa just laughed gleefully, asking them to stop. When it was time to part ways, Winston asked permission to walk Ashley out, and of course she couldn't resist. They decided to walk, leaving Winston's car outside the hospital. They walked for a long time through the beautifully sacred streets. Winston turned out to be a very kind and simple guy. He was a correspondence student and worked for a construction company. Norman, they had a lot in common. They read the same books, watched the same movies, and even liked the weather, the time of year, and cartoons the same way. That evening, they both didn't want to part, but the time was well past midnight, and they agreed to meet the next day. At night, Ashley went to bed smiling happily. She never once remembered. The past bitter experience of love only waited for the next day to come soon. She wanted to see Winston again and talk about anything, as long as they were together. They began to see each other every day. A week later, Winston came to meet her from work with a huge bouquet of flowers and started right away, so to speak, in the forehead. Ashley, please don't interrupt me. I could only dream of such a girl as you. Immediately I knew that this is the wife I wanted to see by my side. Marry me. Maybe it's silly to hear after a week of acquaintance, but I love you. The girl was taken aback. They had only known each other for a short time, and she hadn't even thought about what would happen next. But she suddenly realized that she was afraid of losing him, so she decided to let it happen. All at once, in the same breath, very quietly said Winston, I agree. That same evening, he took her to meet her mother. The boy's father had died at a construction site a long time ago, when the boy was not yet 3, and he lived all these years alone with his mother. Vanessa turned out to be a very nice woman, not tall, with kind eyes. She saw that Ashley was very worried. At once said, Ashley, do not worry, I will not eat you. Moreover, such a protector as my son will always protect you now. Taking the girl to the room, she said that her son had already talked a lot about his Ashley. Vanessa confessed that she was the one who made him bring her here. As they sat at the table and drank tea with the cake Vanessa bought her favorite, Winston said, Mom, I proposed to Ashley today. She said yes. I suggest we go to her father's house soon. I will ask for his hand in marriage. The woman, holding back tears, came up to the girl and hugging her said, I am very happy for you kids. Daughter, I am very happy that my son will have such a wonderful wife. I hope your father won't mind your marriage either. On her day off, Ashley worriedly set the table. My father helped set the chairs and dishes. When she heard that her niece was getting married, her aunt told her she wanted to be there. 05951. They came in full force. Mary, Norman, and of course Brother Louis. They started helping right away, and by the time Vanessa and Winston arrived, already everything was ready. Ashley's excitement quickly faded. It seemed as if everyone gathered had known each other for a long time. At the table, they actively discussed how and where they would celebrate the wedding, what kind of champagne, how much to buy, where to find lipstick. As if they had not even asked the young people, they had already decided everything for them. Winston only cheerfully tried to insert, "Maybe Ashley and I should be asked." To which Norman replied with a wink, "It's up to you two to love each other and kiss each other goodnight at the wedding. So practice." Bitter. Time has passed. On our wedding anniversary, we decided to have that big table in the living room. Everyone from the matchmaking party gathered at my dad's apartment. With the exception of Ashley herself, it just so happened to be the moment when everyone couldn't sit down at the table until they heard the news from the maternity hospital. Early in the morning, Ashley went into labor, and Winston drove her there. And now the table was set with the most exquisite dishes. But everyone was waiting only. Norman and Gerald took a moment and in the kitchen quietly raised a toast of cognac to the health of the woman in labor. As they whispered a toast, the phone rang out. Winston sounded, it seemed, with triple force. After listening to the speaker, he happily threw the phone on the couch and hugged his mother and shouted congratulations to Mammy on her new title. Twice a grandmother. I have 2 daughters. I am the luckiest father. What started in the apartment? Everyone was hugging, kissing, congratulating each other. That evening, the toasts were not only for the happiness of the young, but for the health, Mammy and daughters. Instead of celebratory fireworks at a table, Louis has sounded the news that he and Rosa have decided to get married too. But the surprise to those present was another piece of news. The father stood up and said, "It's time. I want this day to be a memorable one for all of us, but in my own way. We're a grandparent now, and we have the right to say whatever we think. Vanessa, marry me. Let everyone have everything." Right. Vanessa was confused, but to the applause and shouts of bitterness, she could not refuse and kissed her fiancé. If you like the story, please support me with the thumbs up button. It's only one click for you, but it's very important to me. Thank you in advance.